Before the sun cleared the horizon, the desert already held its breath. Pale light seeped across the basin, catching on stones the color of old bone and fencing wire gone dull with years of wind. Nothing moved except a lone pickup truck idling beside a leaning gate, its engine ticking like a tired heart. The rancher sat behind the wheel a moment longer than necessary, one hand resting on the dash as if to steady himself, listening to the silence he had purchased long ago for $25 and a promise he no longer remembered making. He stepped out slowly, boots crunching on gravel, and the cold surprised him even after all these years. The desert did that, swung between mercy and cruelty without apology. He closed the door and did not lock it. There was nothing worth taking anymore. The land stretched in every direction, flat and unforgiving, a place dismissed by surveyors and auctioneers as useless. To him it had once looked honest. Cheap land meant no one expected miracles from it, only endurance. The rancher had endured plenty. He had come here after the bank notices began arriving in thick white envelopes, after the cattle prices dipped and never quite recovered, after neighbors sold out and moved closer to town where the lights stayed on at night. He told himself he chose this place for the quiet, but the truth lay somewhere closer to retreat. Out here, mistakes felt smaller because there was no audience to witness them. He walked the fence line as he did every morning, fingers brushing the wire to feel where it sagged. His hands were rough and split, the skin carrying a map of work done and undone. Each post marked time, the year he replaced it, the year he meant to and never did. At the far end, the fence dissolved into nothing, swallowed by sand. He had stopped repairing that section when the cattle were gone. There was no one left to keep in or out. Near the dry wash he paused. The ground there held shadow longer, and something about its surface felt disturbed. He crouched, knees creaking, and brushed away loose sand. A print emerged, then another, rounded and unmistakable. Hoof marks. Fresh enough that their edges had not yet softened. He stared at them longer than he intended, his breath fogging the air. Horses had not passed through here in years. The rancher knew every track the desert offered him. Coyote, jackrabbit, the occasional antelope cutting across in drought. These were different. Too deliberate. Too close to the house. He straightened slowly, scanning the horizon. Nothing but low hills and a sky bleaching toward blue. He told himself it was nothing, that someone must have driven through overnight, that the wind would erase it by noon. Yet his chest felt tight in a way the cold could not explain. Horses meant trouble. Horses meant water, feed, attention. Horses meant responsibility, and he had spent years learning how to live without it. He continued his walk, but his pace had changed. Every sound seemed louder now, the creak of wire, the rasp of his own breathing. The memory of horses rose uninvited. The weight of a lead rope in his palm, the warmth of a flank under his hand, the way a good animal watched you as if listening. He had sold his last mare 2 winters ago, telling himself it was temporary. She had not looked back. That sale had paid 1 bill and postponed 3 others. He remembered signing the receipt with a pen that barely worked, his name coming out thin and uncertain. Driving home alone, he had kept the window down despite the cold, letting the wind burn his face so he would not think about the empty stall waiting for him. Since then he had avoided the far shed altogether, letting dust claim the tack and the smell of hay fade into memory. By the time he reached the house, the sun was fully up, laying a thin gold sheen across the land. He poured coffee and did not sit down to drink it. Instead, he stood at the window, eyes tracing the wash where the tracks lay hidden from view. The house behind him felt too quiet, the rooms holding echoes of a life pared down to essentials. A folded letter from the county lay on the table, unopened. He knew its weight without lifting it. The letter had arrived days ago, slid under the door by the wind. He could imagine its language without reading it. Assessments, compliance, the polite firmness of people who did not stand in dust to make their living. He had learned that ignoring such things only delayed their return, but this morning he lacked the strength for another negotiation with forces that spoke in numbers instead of need. He moved to the doorway and rested his shoulder against the frame, feeling the wood warm beneath his palm. For a moment he considered going back inside, pretending he had heard nothing, letting habit carry him through another ordinary morning. That choice hovered, fragile, tempting. He had learned that survival sometimes meant narrowing your world until it fit inside your chest. But the tracks outside had already widened it again, just enough to let uncertainty breathe. Outside the wind shifted. It carried a sound he had not heard here before, faint and almost swallowed by distance. A breathy exhale. Then another, followed by the soft scuff of movement on sand. The rancher set his cup down carefully, as if sudden motion might shatter whatever balance remained. He listened again, heart ticking louder than the truck had earlier, and realized the desert was no longer holding its breath at all. It was calling something toward him, or perhaps calling him toward something he was no longer sure he could refuse today, whether he was ready for its answer or not. The moment waited, patient like a held breath. I followed the sound slowly, not wanting to scare whatever waited beyond the wash. The ground dipped, and the wind carried heat now, sharp with the smell of sweat and dust. At the bend, a horse stood alone, head low, ribs visible beneath a hide stretched tight as paper. Its mane hung in uneven ropes and dried foam marked its mouth. The animal lifted its head when it saw me, eyes wide but steady, measuring distance, measuring threat. I did not move. I only breathed, letting the desert decide whether this meeting would break or hold. The horse shifted its weight, one foreleg trembling as if the effort of standing required negotiation. I noticed the marks then, pale scars circling its neck where a halter had once rubbed raw. This was not a wild thing shaped by wind and hunger alone. This was something left behind. The realization settled heavily, pressing against memories I had tried to bury with routine. I spoke without thinking, a low sound meant more for myself than for it, and the horse flicked an ear, listening as if language still mattered here. I took a step forward, then stopped. The distance between us felt charged, fragile as glass. Flies gathered along its flank, and the horse shuddered but did not bolt. I could see every breath expand its ribs, could see how thin the line was between endurance and collapse. Behind me the land lay empty and patient, offering no advice. Ahead of me stood a choice I had sworn I was done making, one that asked not for courage but for commitment. I backed away instead, slow and deliberate, keeping my eyes on the horse until the wash rose between us. At the house, I fetched a bucket, its metal rim clanging louder than I liked, and filled it with water hauled from town days earlier. Each slosh sounded like loss. I carried it back with both hands, arms burning, wondering when practicality had begun to feel like betrayal. The horse watched me return, nostrils flaring, hope and fear tangled together in its stance. I set the bucket down and stepped away. The horse approached in inches, then feet, then finally lowered its muzzle into the water. The sound of drinking filled the air, urgent and unashamed. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I had mistaken for resolve. When the horse lifted its head, water streamed from its lips, and it looked at me again, closer now, as if recognizing a line crossed. It did not thank me. It simply stayed. As the morning stretched on, more shapes appeared at the edges of sight. Another horse, then two more, emerging from gullies and behind scrub, drawn by something older than caution. They were all wrong in similar ways, too thin, too quiet, carrying the evidence of human handling without the benefit of care. I stood among them, suddenly aware of my own smallness, of how quickly solitude had turned into obligation. The desert, it seemed, had delivered witnesses. I walked among them slowly, counting without meaning to. Each body told a different version of the same story. Old brands scarred their hides, numbers and symbols that once meant ownership. Now they meant nothing. One horse leaned into my touch, another flinched away. I adjusted my movements, learning their language again by instinct, remembering how trust was earned through consistency, not force. With every breath, the silence I had bought grew more crowded. By midday, the sun pressed hard, and the horses clustered near the shade of the house. I dragged out a bale of hay meant for winter and split it open, the dry grass smelling faintly of greener seasons. They ate with restraint at first, then urgency as if unsure the gift would last. I watched the supply shrink and felt the math settle in. There was no plan here, only momentum, and momentum had teeth. When the light began to soften, the horses did not leave. They stood, rested, shifted, claimed space with quiet certainty. I leaned against the fence and understood that something irreversible had happened without ceremony or consent. The land was no longer empty, and neither was I. As the first stars appeared, I realized the desert had answered me after all, not with relief, but with a question that would not fade overnight. Weeks passed, and the desert no longer whispered, it spoke in movement and presence. The herd had grown quietly, each new arrival slipping in like a shadow at dawn, shapes emerging from gullies or over distant ridges. I learned their patterns as one might read an old journal, the rhythm of their breaths, the way their ears twitched toward a distant sound, the slight favoring of a limb healed, or still hurting. Some were young, barely more than foals with wobbly knees and wide eyes that mirrored my own cautious hope. Others were older, their coats dull, scars mapping past ownership like faded tattoos. Each one carried a story I had no right to read, and yet I could not look away. The mystery began with the brands. On some, the letters and numbers were familiar, remnants of auctions long forgotten or transporters long gone. Others bore marks I could not trace, symbols whose meaning was buried in some ledger or ledgerless ledger. I started keeping notes, small observations scratched into a notebook with ink smeared by dust and sweat. Names, numbers, dates, anything that might form a pattern, a map that explained how a desert bought for $25 had become a crossroads for the lost. Each entry tightened the knot in my chest, a mixture of fascination and dread. The desert had delivered these lives, but why here and why now? The county began sending letters more frequently. They spoke in formal terms: unauthorized animal habitation, property liability, emergency compliance. They did not ask how the horses arrived, only demanded control. I kept them stacked in the kitchen, reading the typewritten warnings with a mixture of irritation and helplessness. The bureaucracy was steady and indifferent, a force moving slowly but relentlessly. The horses paid no heed, yet their dependence on my attention gave weight to every decision. To feed was to defy protocol, to ignore was to betray life itself. I took to walking the perimeter each evening, notebook in hand, tracing new hoofprints, inspecting each animal for signs of illness or injury. The desert was a mosaic of hardship: dry washes, thorny brush, cracked soil. Shadows lengthened across sand that smelled faintly of sage and sun-baked stone. Dust clung to my boots, wind rattled loose wires, and in these small sounds I found a rhythm that belonged to endurance, not comfort. The horses' patience reminded me of my own. Their watchfulness was a mirror of my cautious hope, a silent insistence that the desert was no longer empty, and neither was I. One evening, near the northern ridge, I spotted a foal that lagged behind the herd. Its flank was slick with sweat, its legs knotted with exhaustion. I crouched in the shadow of a rock, watching it stumble, counting heartbeats until I could no longer delay action. I approached slowly, whispering words I did not expect to matter. The foal lifted its head, eyes wide, and in them I saw recognition of someone willing to intervene. It did not bolt. It allowed me to place a hand against its thin neck, feeling ribs beneath the coat that should have been round with care. That night, I carried the foal to the shed and draped a blanket over its shivering body, listening to its breath slow and steady under the soft lamplight. Curiosity soon merged with necessity. I began asking neighbors quietly about recent horse sales, transporters who came through the county, auctions that promised good deals but delivered fewer. Some neighbors looked away, shaking heads. Others whispered of clandestine transactions, horses abandoned when profit failed. A pattern emerged in fragments. Horses shipped from hundreds of miles away, unloaded in the desert with minimal care, left to drift until someone claimed them or they perished. The system was legal enough to evade prosecution yet cruel enough to leave suffering unquestioned. I jotted each clue into the notebook, heart beating unevenly with the weight of responsibility and the sting of discovery. One morning, the herd circled close to the old barn, hooves stirring dust into golden shafts of light. A mare I had not noticed before stepped forward, ribs showing under a coat marred with rope burns. She froze when I approached, nostrils flaring. I studied her carefully and saw the faint remnant of a brand, half erased by sun and wind. She had traveled far. She had known hands and she had been discarded. The weight of knowing settled on me like a stone, pressing, insistent. These were not random wanderers. Each arrival carried a past of care and neglect, hope and failure. The desert had become a repository for what society no longer claimed. Then the letters escalated. A county official appeared unannounced one afternoon, clipboard in hand, brow furrowed against the sun. "You're creating a problem," they said, voice firm but measured, as though enforcement were a matter of taste rather than necessity. "You're not licensed to maintain this number of animals. You risk fines, property sanctions, and potentially seizure." I nodded, letting the words land without rebuttal. Bureaucracy cared little for the life pressed against my palm, the foal shivering under a blanket, the mare watching from the barn doorway. I had learned early that protest would change little. Only action, consistent and patient, could honor the lives at stake. The external world resisted my efforts in ways both overt and subtle. Water rights required permission, feed deliveries were delayed, neighbors' glances implied judgment. Each barrier tested the quiet determination I had cultivated in solitude, forcing decisions that felt larger than my own strength. Feeding the herd became an act of quiet rebellion, each bale of hay a statement that life mattered more than compliance. Every evening I returned to the wash, tracing footprints, noting arrivals, administering care, listening for the sick, the weak, the newcomers who arrived without explanation. The desert had grown crowded, morally and physically, and I was both its witness and custodian. As I documented the herd, I began to see the outlines of a wider network. Horses with similar scars, similar injuries, appeared across the landscape, carrying signs of human interaction that no natural predator could explain. Auction slips left behind, faint but discernible, suggested an invisible conveyor of abandonment. And yet no one claimed responsibility, no voice demanded attention beyond the formal letters that landed on my desk. I was left to reconcile the lives before me with the emptiness around them, to track the morally invisible hand that had guided these creatures into the desert. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in muted shades of violet and gold, I approached the farthest wash. A foal collapsed mid-stride, weak and trembling. I ran, breath sharp, hands shaking as I lifted it to safety. Around me, the herd huddled in tense anticipation, ears pinned, eyes wide. I understood in that instant that the desert had ceased to be neutral ground. It demanded intervention, claimed commitment, and the ledger of neglect had been placed squarely in my hands. The foal's tiny heartbeat against mine felt like a summons I could not ignore. In the gathering shadows, I realized that the question first posed by the tracks outside my house had grown into a responsibility too vast for one person, and yet one that could not be abandoned. The mystery had deepened, leaving the desert alive with evidence, expectation, and a silent, unyielding moral imperative. The day the officials arrived, the sun was low and harsh, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Their truck rattled over the uneven gravel, brakes squealing, as though the land itself protested the intrusion. I met them at the gate, hands empty, boots pressing into sand that had grown familiar underfoot. They carried clipboards and frowns, speaking in measured tones about licenses, limits, and municipal codes, words meant to cage intention within inked lines. I listened, quiet, letting their authority settle like dust around us, and felt the weight of all the nights I had spent tracking hoofprints, tending wounds, and hauling water through heat and wind. These were not empty charges. They were challenges to the very truth I had been cultivating in silence. Behind me, the horses clustered near the barn, ears pricked, bodies tense but calm. Some had grown fat under careful feeding. Others still bore the thinness of abandonment, though their eyes were brighter, alert to a caretaker who had refused to leave them. I could see the recognition in them, the memory of the first moments when I had offered water, hay, and attention without question. Now they were witnesses, their presence undeniable proof of life preserved, of a small, fragile triumph over neglect. I spoke at last, slowly, letting my words carry the weight of evidence rather than argument. These horses arrived here because no one else claimed responsibility, I said, hands resting on the weathered fence. Some came from auctions, others from transporters. Some were abandoned. I have documented every arrival, every injury, every illness. You can check the records, speak to the neighbors, follow the tracks. My voice was steady, though my chest ached with the accumulation of months spent in vigilance. I did not plead. I presented fact, unadorned, letting the reality of care confront the reality of bureaucracy. One of the officials flicked through my notebook, eyes narrowing at the smudged pages, the dust-stained photographs, the veterinary notes. They frowned at the meticulous accounting, as if documentation alone could not outweigh policy. Another scribbled notes, muttering about liability, enforcement, and potential fines. I remained silent, aware that their language was designed to isolate the moral argument from the legal one, to reduce living creatures to numbers, spaces, and thresholds. But I did not flinch. I had spent months learning to speak in the language of presence, of attention, of quiet proof, and it had a gravity that paper alone could not diminish. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and warm hides. One of the Maras stepped closer to the gate, head lowered, eyes fixed on me. A foal shuffled behind her, hesitant but curious, then another, forming a line of living testimony. Each animal moved as if understanding the tension, as if acknowledging that this moment was the culmination of countless unseen hours. The desert had grown still around us, not in fear but in recognition. The very land bore witness to the moral weight pressed against its arid soil. The officials debated quietly, voices dropping to a murmur I could not fully catch. One stepped back, squinting at the horizon where the herd spread across the dunes, their forms outlined in gold and shadow. I sensed a shift. Compliance and authority faced the undeniable fact of survival, of stewardship lived and sustained. The scales were tipping, not by threat or anger but by evidence, by life itself standing firm against neglect. Each step I had taken to document, feed, tend, and record mattered now, converging into a force neither law nor ledger could ignore. A letter had arrived days earlier from the county, demanding the removal of excess animals or the imposition of fines. I had set it aside, letting the words settle under dust and time, trusting the records I kept and the truth I upheld. Now, it seemed, the weight of accumulation, the careful notes, the veterinary reports, the photographs, the persistent presence, had created leverage greater than any citation. The officials stepped aside, glancing at one another, hesitant, as though realizing that enforcement against compassion was no longer tenable. I walked toward the nearest horse, hand extended, feeling the warmth of its neck beneath my palm. It trembled briefly and then relaxed, exhaling a long, steady breath. Around us, the herd shifted subtly, eyes bright, ears alert, bodies moving with quiet confidence. The sun dipped further, streaking the sky with shades of rose and copper. Shadows stretched long across the desert, yet there was no sense of ending, only of completion, of the delicate alignment between care and consequence. The mare with the halter scars nudged my side gently, and the foal stepped close, tentative but seeking proximity. I looked back at the officials, standing silently, absorbed in the sight of living proof. Their faces betrayed a recognition I did not need them to voice. The desert had become a sanctuary not by regulation, not by chance, but by persistence, by a refusal to ignore those abandoned. The law had been slow, but the moral arc had bent toward recognition. As evening fell, I guided the horses into the barn, careful to respect their space, letting them settle into familiarity and routine. Each animal moved with awareness, the slightest flinch or hesitation telling me which had grown wary and which had begun to trust. By lamplight, I checked each one, administering care where it was needed, documenting conditions, noting progress. The air smelled of hay, dust, and warm hides, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of bureaucracy that had filled the day. Night deepened, and the desert softened beneath a pale crescent moon. Stars scattered across the sky, indifferent and yet somehow present, illuminating the contours of dunes and ridges, tracing shadows along the fence lines. I stood at the edge of the barn, listening to the horses breathing in rhythm, a chorus of life that had once been precarious and now persisted. The weight in my chest eased, replaced by a quiet awareness that the desert, the land I had once considered worthless, had become a place of consequence and redemption. I thought of the first hoofprints, the tremble of the foal, the wary gaze of the mare, and understood that the reckoning had not been with the officials, nor with law alone. It had been with the desert itself, with life presented as truth, compelling recognition, demanding stewardship. Authority had come with paper and penalties, but the moral force of presence had been quieter, subtler, unyielding. And in that recognition, the land and its creatures had been vindicated. The night air carried a gentle wind, stirring manes and brushing against the dust-laden fence. I stepped back, watching the herd settle, hearing the soft shuffle of hooves against straw. Somewhere between shadow and moonlight, I realized that the question first posed by those initial tracks had found its answer. Responsibility had been claimed, not in haste or desire for accolade, but in the slow, steady rhythm of attention and care. The desert was no longer silent. It had spoken and we had listened. And yet, as I turned toward the horizon, the desert stretched beyond the light, vast and unknowable, suggesting that the work, the moral vigilance, would never truly end. But for this night, for this moment, truth had held against indifference and life, tender, resilient, persistent, had prevailed.